They thought the new English teacher would be an easy target when they snatched her homemade lunch right from her hands in the crowded cafeteria. Jake Williams and his crew had no idea that Ms. Sarah Martinez had spent 8 years mastering the ancient art of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, learning to read body language like poetry and control situations with the precision of a chess master. What happened next didn't just shock the entire student body of Riverside High School, it completely transformed how a struggling mountain community understood the true meaning of strength and respect. The quiet new teacher who seemed so vulnerable would demonstrate that real power comes not from intimidation, but from the confidence to protect yourself and others when words are no longer enough. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The late October air carried the scent of aspen leaves and early snow through the hallways of Riverside High School, nestled in the heart of Clearwater, Colorado, where the Rocky Mountains created a dramatic backdrop for the daily dramas of teenage life. The school's red brick facade had weathered 40 years of mountain winters, and inside, fluorescent lights hummed over polished linoleum floors that reflected the hurried footsteps of 800 students navigating the complex social ecosystem that defined their world. The afternoon lunch period buzzed with that particular energy of adolescents caught between childhood and adulthood, their conversations echoing off the walls of Mountain View Cafeteria as they clustered around rectangular tables that had seen generations of spilled milk, whispered secrets, and the invisible territorial boundaries that teenagers drew with remarkable precision. Sarah Martinez stood at the faculty microwave in the corner of the teacher's lounge, heating up the homemade enchiladas her mother had taught her to make during those precious weekends when she drove the 4 hours back to Phoenix to visit family. At 26, Sarah possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of facing challenges head-on, though most of her colleagues at Riverside High had no idea about the depth of experience that lay beneath her soft-spoken demeanor. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore the kind of modest professional attire that helped her blend into the background of faculty meetings and parent conferences. What they couldn't see was the way she moved with subtle precision, her posture reflecting years of training that had taught her to stay centered under pressure and read the intentions of others long before they acted upon them. This was only Sarah's second month at Riverside High, her first teaching position after completing her education degree at Arizona State University, and she was still learning to navigate the complex dynamics of a school community that had been shaped by economic uncertainty and the particular challenges of a small mountain town where everyone knew everyone else's business. She had chosen Clearwater specifically because she wanted to make a difference in a place that needed dedicated teachers, drawn by Principal Johnson's honest assessment during her interview that the school was struggling with budget cuts, declining test scores, and a culture of disrespect that had been building for years. The previous English teacher had left mid-semester after what the principal delicately described as burnout, though Sarah had quickly learned from other faculty members that the real story involved students who had made the woman's life so miserable that she had simply walked out one day and never returned. Jake Williams commanded attention in the cafeteria through a combination of natural charisma and carefully cultivated intimidation, his presence announced by the way conversations shifted when he walked past tables, and the manner in which younger students instinctively moved aside to give him space. At 15, he had the broad shoulders and confident swagger of someone who had been told since elementary school that he was destined for greatness, first as a star of the junior varsity football team, and more recently as the unofficial leader of a group that specialized in making life difficult for anyone they perceived as weak or different. His sandy brown hair was styled with the kind of expensive product that reflected his family's status in the community, and his clothes carried the subtle markers of wealth that mattered enormously in a school where economic differences created sharp dividing lines between students. Jake's parents had divorced the previous spring in a bitter legal battle that had been front-page news in the Clearwater Gazette, their custody dispute playing out in a courtroom where accusations of infidelity and financial misconduct had embarrassed their teenage son in ways he had never learned to process healthily. The anger and humiliation he felt about his family's public dissolution had been redirected toward anyone he could control, transforming a naturally outgoing personality into something harder and more calculating. He had discovered that making others feel small temporarily filled the hollow space where his sense of security used to reside, though the satisfaction never lasted long enough to address the deeper pain that drove his behavior. Ryan Chen had attached himself to Jake's group during his freshman year after spending most of middle school as the target of bullying himself, discovering that aligning with power was easier than developing the confidence to stand alone. At 14, Ryan possessed the kind of nervous intelligence that made him valuable to Jake as both a strategist and a technology expert. His ability to hack into school systems and social media accounts, providing the group with information they used to identify and exploit the vulnerabilities of their targets. Ryan's parents had immigrated from Taiwan with dreams of providing their son with opportunities they had never had, working 16-hour days at their small restaurant downtown to pay for his advanced computer equipment and tutoring sessions. They had no idea that their quiet, studious son had learned to survive high school by participating in the systematic humiliation of his classmates. Mason Thompson represented the most unsettling member of Jake's crew, a 16-year-old whose silence carried more menace than any verbal threat could convey. Tall and lean with dark hair that fell across his eyes, Mason had learned early that physical presence could be more intimidating than actual violence. His role in the group primarily involving the kind of looming proximity that made targets understand they were outnumbered and outmatched. Unlike Jake and Ryan, who were driven by personal insecurities and social calculation, Mason seemed to find genuine satisfaction in the fear he created, his capacity for cruelty limited only by Jake's strategic thinking about what they could get away with without triggering serious administrative consequences. Principal Johnson had been leading Riverside High School for 3 years, long enough to understand the scope of the challenges he faced, but not long enough to feel confident about his ability to address them effectively. A former history teacher who had moved into administration with hopes of creating positive change, he found himself constantly overwhelmed by budget pressures, demanding parents, and a faculty that seemed as divided and demoralized as the student body. He had hired Sarah Martinez because her references were outstanding, and because he sensed in her the kind of dedication and resilience that the school desperately needed. But he worried constantly about whether he was asking too much of a young teacher who had no idea what she was walking into. Coach Davis taught physical education and coached the wrestling team, his classroom management style shaped by 20 years of military service before he entered education. Unlike many of his colleagues who had grown cynical about their ability to influence student behavior, Coach Davis maintained an unwavering belief that every teenager could be reached if you found the right approach and invested enough time in understanding what motivated them. He had noticed Jake Williams's increasing aggression both in the gymnasium and around campus, recognizing the signs of a young man whose anger was eating him alive from the inside out. Coach Davis had tried several times to engage Jake in conversations about channeling his energy more constructively, but the teenager had rebuffed these attempts with the kind of polite hostility that made clear he viewed adult intervention as weakness rather than concern. Dr. Patricia Hayes served as the school's counselor, though her caseload of 300 students made it nearly impossible to provide the kind of individualized attention that many of them desperately needed. A soft-spoken woman in her 40s who had returned to graduate school after raising her own children, Dr. Hayes understood adolescent psychology well enough to recognize that the behavioral problems she observed daily were symptoms of deeper issues related to family instability, economic stress, and the particular challenges of growing up in a community where opportunities felt limited. She had been tracking Jake Williams and his associates for months, documenting incidents and building cases for intervention, but she also knew that without buy-in from the students themselves, her efforts would have minimal impact. The culture at Riverside High School had been deteriorating for several years, shaped by a combination of factors that fed off each other in destructive ways. Budget cuts had eliminated many of the extracurricular programs that once provided students with positive outlets for their energy and opportunities to develop leadership skills in constructive contexts. Teacher turnover had created instability in many departments, with long-term substitutes and inexperienced educators struggling to maintain classroom authority with students who had learned to exploit weakness. The economic challenges facing many families in Clearwater had created stress that teenagers absorbed and reflected in their interactions with peers, their frustration about circumstances beyond their control, manifesting as aggression toward anyone they could influence. Sarah's classroom, room 118, occupied a corner of the English wing where large windows provided views of the mountains that surrounded the valley, but also revealed the contrast between the natural beauty of the setting and the institutional dreariness of the building itself. Her bulletin boards displayed student work alongside inspirational quotes about the power of literature to change perspectives and expand understanding, though she had quickly learned that many of her students viewed reading and writing as irrelevant to their lives and futures. Her lesson plans emphasized discussion and critical thinking over standardized test preparation, an approach that had earned praise from administrators but resistance from students who had been trained to expect education to be something done to them rather than something they participated in actively. The teaching profession had called to Sarah during her junior year of college when she was volunteering as a tutor at a community center in a low-income neighborhood of Phoenix, working with middle school students whose academic struggles clearly stemmed from factors that extended far beyond their intellectual capabilities. She had watched as dedicated teachers transformed the trajectories of young people who had been written off by other adults, and she had decided that she wanted to spend her career providing the kind of support and encouragement that could help teenagers discover their own potential. Her education professors had warned her about the challenges she would face, particularly as a young woman entering schools where authority was often questioned and respect had to be earned rather than assumed. But Sarah had felt confident that her preparation and passion would be sufficient to overcome any obstacles. What Sarah had not shared with her colleagues or preparing and narrating the story took us a lot of time. So, if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As administrators was the parallel education she had been receiving for the past 8 years at a Brazilian Jiu Jitsu academy in Phoenix, where Professor Miguel Santos had taught her not just physical techniques, but a philosophy of strength that emphasized mental discipline, emotional control, and the wisdom to use force only when absolutely necessary. Sarah had begun training during her freshman year of college after a frightening encounter with an aggressive ex-boyfriend had left her feeling vulnerable and powerless, seeking not just self-defense skills but the kind of confidence that came from knowing she could protect herself if circumstances required it. Professor Santos, a former competitor who had transitioned into teaching after retiring from professional fighting, had emphasized from the beginning that the most important battles were won in the mind rather than on the mat, that true martial artists were distinguished not by their ability to defeat opponents, but by their capacity to avoid conflicts while maintaining their dignity and principles. The techniques Sarah had mastered went far beyond the physical movements that most people associated with martial arts, encompassing a deep understanding of leverage, timing, and psychological strategy that applied to many situations outside the training environment. She had learned to read body language with the precision of a scientist, recognizing the subtle signs that indicated when someone was preparing to become aggressive and understanding how to position herself to minimize risk while maximizing her options for response. More importantly, she had developed the kind of mental composure that allowed her to remain calm under pressure, to think clearly when others were acting on emotion, and to choose her responses based on wisdom rather than impulse. Professor Santos had often told his students that the ultimate goal of martial arts training was to become someone who never needed to fight, whose presence and demeanor discouraged aggression, while inspiring respect. He taught them that strength was most powerful when it was invisible, that the greatest warriors in history were often those who won their battles before they began, by understanding human nature and knowing how to appeal to the better angels of their opponents' personalities. Sarah had absorbed these lessons alongside the physical skills, developing a philosophy of interaction that emphasized de-escalation, empathy, and the strategic use of vulnerability as a form of strength rather than weakness. Her mother, Maria Martinez, had reinforced these principles through her own example as a social worker who had spent 30 years helping families navigate crisis situations and find paths toward stability and healing. Maria had taught her daughter that the most effective way to change someone's behavior was not through confrontation or punishment, but through creating conditions where they could choose to be better than they currently were, providing support and accountability while maintaining clear boundaries about what was and was not acceptable. These lessons had shaped Sarah's approach to teaching, her belief that every student could learn and grow if provided with the right combination of challenge, support, and respect. The lunch period at Riverside High School represented a daily test of the social order that students had established through months of careful negotiation and occasional conflict, with territories claimed and defended through subtle demonstrations of power that most adults never noticed or understood. Jake Williams and his crew had established their dominance over a prime section of the cafeteria, where their table provided optimal visibility of the entire room, while maintaining easy access to the exits and the areas where younger students congregated. Their presence served as both entertainment and warning to the rest of the student body, a reminder that stepping out of line or showing weakness could result in becoming the target of attention that no one wanted to receive. Sarah typically spent her lunch period in her classroom, grading papers, or preparing for afternoon classes while eating the meals she brought from home, finding the cafeteria environment too chaotic and stressful to provide the kind of peaceful break she needed in the middle of her teaching day. But on this particular Wednesday in late October, she had promised to supervise a makeup test for a student who had been absent the previous day, which meant venturing into the social battlefield of Mountain View Cafeteria to retrieve her lunch from the faculty refrigerator before returning to the relative sanctuary of room 118. She had no way of knowing that this simple deviation from her normal routine would set in motion a series of events that would test everything she had learned about strength, wisdom, and the delicate art of choosing when to fight and when to find another way forward. The architecture of social power at Riverside High School revealed itself most clearly during lunch period, when the removal of classroom structure allowed the true hierarchies to emerge like mountain peaks through clearing fog. Sarah Martinez had observed these dynamics from a distance during her first weeks at the school, noting how students moved through the cafeteria with an awareness of invisible boundaries that governed their interactions as surely as any written rule. The popular athletes claimed the central tables near the windows, their laughter echoing across the room with the confidence of those who had never questioned their right to occupy prime real estate. The academic achievers clustered near the quieter corners, their conversations punctuated by the rustle of homework assignments and the soft clicking of calculator keys. The artistic students gathered around tables covered with sketchbooks and sheet music, creating small islands of creativity in an ocean of social calculation. Jake Williams had positioned himself and his crew at what amounted to the power center of this ecosystem, a round table that provided clear sightlines to every entrance and exit, while remaining close enough to the main traffic flow to ensure that their presence registered with every student who passed by. The location had been carefully chosen not just for its strategic advantages but for its symbolic value, communicating to the entire student body that this group operated by different rules than everyone else. Their conversations carried the casual arrogance of people who had never experienced genuine consequences for their actions, peppered with references to parties they planned to attend, teachers they considered jokes, and classmates they found amusing targets for their attention. Ryan Chen sat to Jake's left, his expensive laptop open to what appeared to be schoolwork, but was actually a sophisticated monitoring system he had developed to track the social media activity of their potential victims. His programming skills had evolved far beyond what his computer science teacher imagined, encompassing everything from basic hacking techniques to advanced social engineering strategies that allowed him to gather information about students' vulnerabilities and family situations. Ryan took genuine pride in his technical abilities, viewing himself as the intellectual backbone of their operation, though he carefully concealed the satisfaction he derived from using his talents to cause emotional pain rather than create something constructive. Mason Thompson occupied the chair directly across from Jake, his positioning deliberate and calculated to maximize his intimidating presence while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation. His lunch tray remained largely untouched, as eating would require him to look down and potentially miss the subtle social cues that informed their group's decision-making about when and how to assert their dominance. Mason had developed an almost predatory awareness of weakness, his dark eyes constantly scanning the cafeteria for signs of vulnerability that could be exploited for their entertainment. Unlike his companions, who were motivated primarily by their own insecurities and need for social validation, Mason seemed to find genuine pleasure in the fear he inspired, as if the discomfort of others provided him with a form of nourishment that actual food could never match. The supporting cast of their social circle included several other students who orbited around Jake's core group, with varying degrees of commitment and enthusiasm, drawn by the protection that association provided, while remaining nervous about the potential consequences of being too closely identified with their more extreme behaviors. These peripheral members served important functions as lookouts, messengers, and witnesses, whose presence legitimized the group's actions by making them appear more broadly supported than they actually were. Most of these hangers-on understood intuitively that their membership was conditional and could be revoked at any moment if they failed to demonstrate sufficient loyalty, or if Jake decided they had become more liability than asset. The faculty supervision during lunch period remained minimal and largely ineffective, with most teachers using the time for their own meal breaks or administrative tasks rather than actively monitoring student behavior. Those staff members who did venture into the cafeteria typically positioned themselves near the serving lines or exit doors, focusing on preventing obvious violations like food fights or unauthorized departures, rather than attending to the subtler forms of psychological warfare that shape the daily experience of many students. This lack of adult oversight had created an environment where students like Jake Williams could operate with relative impunity, confident that their carefully calculated cruelties would remain invisible to the authority figures who might otherwise intervene. Coach Davis represented the notable exception to this pattern of faculty disengagement, making regular appearances in the cafeteria not to enforce specific rules, but to maintain his awareness of the social dynamics that affected his students' lives outside the gymnasium. His military background had taught him to recognize the signs of brewing conflict before they erupted into open confrontation, and he had been tracking Jake Williams's increasing aggression with the concern of someone who understood how quickly teenage posturing could escalate into something more serious. Coach Davis had attempted several times to engage Jake in conversations about leadership and responsibility, but the teenager had deflected these overtures with the practiced skill of someone who had learned to manipulate adult concern while avoiding genuine accountability. The economic stratification of Clearwater revealed itself clearly in the cafeteria's social geography, with students from wealthier families occupying the prime territories while those from working-class households clustered in less desirable areas or avoided the space altogether by eating in empty classrooms or the library. Jake Williams's family wealth provided him with advantages that extended far beyond his ability to purchase expensive clothes and equipment, encompassing access to legal resources, political connections, and social capital that insulated him from many of the consequences that might otherwise have modified his behavior. His mother's position on the school board and his father's ownership of the largest construction company in the valley created a protective bubble that teachers and administrators were reluctant to pierce, even when Jake's actions clearly warranted intervention. Sarah Martinez had begun to understand these dynamics through careful observation rather than direct explanation, her outsider status providing her with perspectives that longtime faculty members had lost through years of accommodation and compromise. She noticed how certain students seemed to shrink into themselves when Jake Williams walked past their tables, how conversations quieted when his group's laughter became too loud, how the general energy of the cafeteria shifted depending on whether his crew was present or absent. These observations troubled her both as an educator and as someone whose martial arts training had taught her to recognize the signs of systematic intimidation and abuse of power. The physical layout of Mountain View Cafeteria had been designed decades earlier, when the school's enrollment was significantly smaller and the social dynamics considerably less complex, resulting in a space that amplified rather than contained the tensions that naturally arose when 800 teenagers were compressed into a single room for 30 minutes each day. The high ceilings and hard surfaces created an acoustic environment where every conversation competed with every other, forcing students to speak louder and more aggressively than they might otherwise choose. The long rectangular tables accommodated large groups, but made private conversations impossible, creating pressure for students to perform their social identities rather than simply exist comfortably with their friends. Dr. Patricia Hayes had documented the correlation between cafeteria incidents and overall disciplinary problems at Riverside High School, recognizing that the social hierarchies established during lunch period extended into classrooms, hallways, and even weekend activities throughout the community. Her research had convinced her that addressing the school's cultural problems would require fundamental changes to how students interacted during unstructured time, but her recommendations for increased supervision, modified seating arrangements, and structured activities had been rejected by administrators who viewed such measures as unnecessarily expensive and potentially counterproductive to student development. The teaching staff at Riverside High School had developed various strategies for coping with the challenging environment, ranging from Coach Davis's proactive engagement to complete withdrawal from any situation that might involve confrontation with difficult students. Many of the veteran teachers had learned to focus exclusively on academics, while avoiding the social and emotional issues that affected their students' ability to learn, viewing classroom management as a matter of maintaining order rather than creating conditions where genuine education could occur. This approach had resulted in an institutional culture where problems were managed rather than solved, symptoms were addressed while root causes remained untouched, and individual teachers felt isolated and unsupported in their efforts to make a meaningful difference. Sarah's approach to teaching had been shaped by her understanding that learning required students to feel safe enough to take intellectual risks, to ask questions that revealed their confusion, and to engage in discussions that might challenge their existing beliefs and assumptions. Her martial arts training had taught her that real strength came from creating environments where everyone could grow and succeed rather than from dominating those who were weaker or less experienced. This philosophy had influenced her classroom management style, her approach to grading and feedback, and her interactions with students who seemed resistant to traditional educational methods. The Mexican food that Sarah carried in her insulated lunch bag represented more than simple sustenance, embodying her connection to family traditions and cultural identity that she had maintained despite moving hundreds of miles from home for her teaching position. Her mother had spent hours teaching her to prepare the enchiladas, with the kind of care and attention that transformed cooking from mere food preparation into an expression of love and cultural continuity. The familiar flavors provided Sarah with comfort and grounding during the challenging early months of her teaching career, reminding her of the values and relationships that had shaped her character and would continue to sustain her through whatever difficulties she might encounter. The timing of Sarah's lunch break had been carefully planned to avoid the peak congestion periods when the cafeteria became most chaotic and stressful, but her commitment to helping a struggling student complete a makeup examination had disrupted her usual routine and forced her to navigate the social battlefield during one of its most active periods. As she approached the faculty refrigerator located in a small alcove adjacent to the main serving area, Sarah became acutely aware of the tension that seemed to hover over the entire room like an approaching thunderstorm, the conversations slightly too loud, the laughter slightly too forced, the movement slightly too aggressive to suggest genuine comfort or happiness. Jake Williams had been tracking Sarah's movement across the cafeteria from the moment she entered, his predatory instincts activated by the appearance of what he perceived as a target of opportunity. The new English teacher represented everything that irritated him about the adult world, from her earnest attempts to make literature relevant to contemporary life, to her obvious belief that education could somehow transform students who had no interest in being transformed. Her youth made her seem more like a peer than an authority figure, while her small stature and soft-spoken demeanor suggested vulnerability that could be exploited without serious risk of meaningful retaliation. Ryan Chen had already conducted extensive research into Sarah Martinez's background, using his technical skills to gather information about her education, her family, her financial situation, and her social media presence. This intelligence gathering had revealed details that could potentially be used to embarrass or undermine her, from her student loan debt to photographs from her college years that could be taken out of context to create damaging narratives. Ryan took pride in his ability to weaponize information, viewing knowledge as a form of power that could be deployed strategically to achieve desired outcomes with minimal risk of direct confrontation. Mason Thompson had been observing Sarah's classroom management techniques during his assigned study hall periods, noting what he perceived as signs of inexperience and uncertainty that could be exploited if the opportunity arose. Her attempts to engage students in meaningful discussions about literature had struck him as naive and potentially amusing, particularly given his awareness of how easily classroom dynamics could be disrupted by students who understood how to push the right buttons at the right times. Mason had developed considerable skill in appearing cooperative, while actually undermining authority through subtle acts of defiance that were difficult to document or address through traditional disciplinary channels. The convergence of these factors created what military strategists might recognize as a perfect storm, a situation where multiple elements combined to create conditions that were far more dangerous than any individual component might suggest. Sarah's deviation from her normal routine had placed her in an environment where she was vulnerable, while Jake Williams' need to demonstrate his power to his followers had reached a threshold where some form of action seemed inevitable. The lack of meaningful adult supervision and the presence of an audience that could validate or reject their performance added additional pressure to a situation that was already unstable. The homemade enchiladas that Sarah retrieved from the faculty refrigerator represented hours of careful preparation and the kind of cultural connection that had helped sustain her through the challenges of adapting to life in a new community. The familiar aromas that escaped when she opened the container provided a momentary sense of comfort and grounding, reminding her of Sunday dinners with her extended family and the warmth of relationships that transcended the professional obligations and social complexities that dominated her daily experience at Riverside High School. These moments of connection to her authentic self had become increasingly precious as she navigated the demands of her teaching position and the subtle stresses of living in a place where she had not yet established deep roots or genuine friendships. The decision to eat in her classroom rather than the faculty lounge reflected Sarah's growing understanding that she needed quiet time to process the emotional demands of teaching adolescents who carried their own complex burdens of family stress, social pressure, and economic uncertainty. Her martial arts training had taught her the importance of maintaining mental and emotional balance, particularly in environments where conflict was common and stress levels remained consistently high. The few minutes of solitude that her classroom provided allowed her to center herself and prepare for the afternoon classes that would require her to be fully present and responsive to her students' needs. As Sarah turned away from the refrigerator with her lunch container in hand, she became aware of a shift in the energy around Jake Williams's table, a subtle but unmistakable change in the quality of attention that reminded her of the moment in sparring sessions when an opponent began to commit to an attack. Her peripheral vision caught the exchange of glances between Jake and his companions, the kind of silent communication that preceded coordinated action, though she had no way of knowing that she had become the focus of their planning or that her simple act of retrieving her lunch had triggered a sequence of events that would test everything she had learned about strength, wisdom, and the delicate art of responding to aggression with dignity and controlled power. The invisible threads that connected every social interaction at Riverside High School had been woven through years of careful negotiation, subtle intimidation, and the kind of unspoken agreements that governed adolescent society with more precision than any written constitution. Jake Williams understood these dynamics intuitively, recognizing that his position at the apex of the student hierarchy required constant maintenance through strategic demonstrations of power that reminded everyone else of their place in the carefully constructed order. The appearance of Sarah Martinez in the cafeteria represented an opportunity to reinforce his dominance while providing entertainment for his followers, who had grown restless during the relative peace of recent weeks and were eager for the kind of spectacle that would remind them why their allegiance to Jake provided both protection and access to the adrenaline rush of controlled cruelty. The target selection process that Jake employed bore the hallmarks of a predator's calculation, involving careful assessment of vulnerability, potential resistance, and the likelihood of meaningful consequences. Sarah Martinez had attracted his attention not merely because she was new to the school community, but because her obvious dedication to her teaching mission suggested the kind of idealism that could be easily exploited and publicly deflated. Her youth and small physical stature made her appear less threatening than veteran teachers who had learned to project authority through years of classroom management experience, while her earnest attempts to connect with students revealed an emotional investment that could be turned into a weapon against her if properly manipulated. Ryan Chen had been monitoring Sarah's digital footprint for weeks, using sophisticated techniques to gather intelligence about her background, her family situation, and her personal interests in ways that would have impressed corporate recruiters or private investigators. His research had revealed details about her financial struggles as a first-year teacher, her close relationship with her mother in Phoenix, and her apparent lack of romantic attachments that might provide emotional support during difficult periods. This information formed the foundation of a psychological profile that Jake could exploit to maximize the emotional impact of whatever humiliation they decided to inflict, ensuring that their actions would resonate far beyond the immediate moment of confrontation. Mason Thompson had been studying Sarah's behavioral patterns during the brief interactions he had. Roots or genuine friendships. The decision to eat in her classroom rather than the faculty lounge reflected Sarah's growing understanding that she needed quiet time to process the emotional demands of teaching adolescents who carried their own complex burdens of family stress, social pressure, and economic uncertainty. Her martial arts training had taught her the importance of maintaining mental and emotional balance, particularly in environments where conflict was common and stress levels remained consistently high. The few minutes of solitude that her classroom provided allowed her to center herself and prepare for the afternoon classes that would require her to be fully present and responsive to her students' needs. As Sarah turned away from the refrigerator with her lunch container in hand, she became aware of a shift in the energy around Jake Williams's table, a subtle but unmistakable change in the quality of attention that reminded her of the moment in sparring sessions when an opponent began to commit to an attack. Her peripheral vision caught the exchange of glances between Jake and his companions, the kind of silent communication that preceded coordinated action, though she had no way of knowing that she had become the focus of their planning or that her simple act of retrieving her lunch had triggered a sequence of events that would test everything she had learned about strength, wisdom, and the delicate art of responding to aggression with dignity and controlled power. The invisible threads that connected every social interaction at Riverside High School had been woven through years of careful negotiation, subtle intimidation, and the kind of unspoken agreements that governed adolescent society with more precision than any written constitution. Jake Williams understood these dynamics intuitively, recognizing that his position at the apex of the student hierarchy required constant maintenance through strategic demonstrations of power that reminded everyone else of their place in the carefully constructed order. The appearance of Sarah Martinez in the cafeteria represented an opportunity to reinforce his dominance while providing entertainment for his followers, who had grown restless during the relative peace of recent weeks and were eager for the kind of spectacle that would remind them why their allegiance to Jake provided both protection and access to the adrenaline rush of controlled cruelty. The target selection process that Jake employed bore the hallmarks of a predator's calculation, involving careful assessment of vulnerability, potential resistance, and the likelihood of meaningful consequences. Sarah Martinez had attracted his attention not merely because she was new to the school community, but because her obvious dedication to her teaching mission suggested the kind of idealism that could be easily exploited and publicly deflated. Her youth and small physical stature made her appear less threatening than veteran teachers who had learned to project authority through years of classroom management experience, while her earnest attempts to connect with students revealed an emotional investment that could be turned into a weapon against her if properly manipulated. Ryan Chen had been monitoring Sarah's digital footprint for weeks, using sophisticated techniques to gather intelligence about her background, her family situation, and her personal interests in ways that would have impressed corporate recruiters or private investigators. His research had revealed details about her financial struggles as a first-year teacher, her close relationship with her mother in Phoenix, and her apparent lack of romantic attachments that might provide emotional support during difficult periods. This information formed the foundation of a psychological profile that Jake could exploit to maximize the emotional impact of whatever humiliation they decided to inflict, ensuring that their actions would resonate far beyond the immediate moment of confrontation. Mason Thompson had been studying Sarah's behavioral patterns during the brief interactions he had observed in hallways and during his assigned study hall periods in her classroom, noting what he interpreted as signs of uncertainty and inexperience that could be leveraged to their advantage. Her attempts to establish rapport with students through casual conversation and her obvious concern for those who seemed struggling or isolated suggested a personality that prioritized empathy over authority, making her potentially reluctant to invoke administrative consequences that might damage her relationships with the broader student body. Mason had learned to recognize these characteristics in adults who could be manipulated through appeals to their desire to be liked and accepted, rather than simply respected and obeyed. The psychological mechanics of group intimidation required careful orchestration to achieve maximum effect while maintaining plausible deniability about the true nature of what was occurring, and Jake Williams had perfected techniques that allowed his crew to operate just below the threshold of behavior that would trigger serious administrative intervention. Their approach relied heavily on ambiguity and misdirection, creating situations where their actions could be interpreted as harmless pranks or misunderstandings by adults who had not witnessed the full context of the interaction. This strategy had protected them from meaningful consequences during previous incidents, while allowing them to escalate their behavior gradually as they tested the boundaries of what they could accomplish without facing serious repercussions. The broader student body at Riverside High School had learned to navigate the presence of Jake Williams's group through a combination of avoidance, appeasement, and the kind of hypervigilance that characterized life in environments where unpredictable violence remained a constant possibility. Students who might otherwise have intervened to protect victims had been conditioned through observation and experience to understand that drawing attention to themselves would likely result in becoming targets themselves, creating a climate where bystanders remained passive even when witnessing behavior they recognized as cruel and unjustified. This learned helplessness had become one of Jake's most valuable assets, ensuring that his actions would be witnessed but not actively opposed by the majority of students who possessed the numerical advantage that could neutralize his influence if they chose to act collectively. Coach Davis had developed an almost supernatural awareness of the subtle energy shifts that preceded violent confrontations, his military training having taught him to recognize the physiological and behavioral changes that indicated when individuals or groups were preparing to transition from posturing to actual aggression. The particular quality of tension that had begun to permeate the cafeteria triggered his internal alarm systems, though the crowded environment and complex social dynamics made it difficult for him to identify the specific source of his concern or determine what intervention might be appropriate. His position near the serving line provided excellent visibility of the entire room, but the distance between his location and Jake Williams's table meant that any attempt to intervene would require him to move deliberately across the cafeteria in a way that might escalate rather than diffuse whatever situation was developing. Dr. Patricia Hayes had been documenting patterns of aggressive behavior at Riverside High School for months, her research revealing correlations between certain environmental factors and the likelihood of disciplinary incidents that could help predict when and where problems were most likely to occur. The combination of factors present during this particular lunch period matched several of the high-risk profiles she had identified, including the presence of known aggressors, minimal adult supervision, and the kind of social pressure that encouraged students to perform for their peers rather than make responsible choices about their behavior. Her office overlooked the cafeteria through a series of windows that had been installed to facilitate monitoring, but the angle and distance made it impossible for her to observe specific interactions or hear conversations that might provide early warning of developing conflicts. The administrative philosophy at Riverside High School had evolved over years of budget constraints and political pressure into an approach that prioritized reactive crisis management over proactive intervention, resulting in a system where problems were addressed only after they had escalated to levels that could no longer be ignored or minimized. Principal Johnson had inherited this framework from his predecessor, and had found himself trapped between competing demands from school board members who wanted visible discipline, parents who demanded protection for their children, and faculty members who felt unsupported in their efforts to maintain classroom authority. The result was an institutional culture where teachers and students alike understood that help would arrive only after damage had already been done, creating incentives for both victims and perpetrators to handle conflicts privately rather than risk the uncertain consequences of official involvement. Sarah Martinez had begun to sense the shift in atmospheric pressure that preceded social storms during her weeks of observation at Riverside High School, her martial arts training having sensitized her to the subtle cues that indicated when environments were becoming dangerous or unstable. The particular quality of attention she was receiving from Jake Williams's table felt familiar from her sparring experience, reminiscent of the moment when an opponent began to commit mental energy to planning an attack while still maintaining the pretense of casual interaction. Her body responded automatically to these signals by entering a state of relaxed alertness that allowed her to continue moving naturally while preparing for the possibility that she might need to defend herself or others without advance warning. The homemade lunch container that Sarah carried represented more than simple nourishment, embodying connections to family, culture, and personal identity that had sustained her through the challenges of adapting to life in an unfamiliar community, where she had not yet established the kind of relationships that provide emotional security and social support. The familiar aromas that escaped when she had opened the container earlier provided a momentary bridge to the warmth and acceptance she had known throughout her childhood, reminding her of Sunday dinners, where multiple generations gathered to share not only food but stories, wisdom, and the kind of unconditional love that helped individuals maintain their sense of worth, even when facing criticism or rejection from the outside world. The decision to eat lunch in her classroom rather than the faculty lounge reflected Sarah's growing understanding that she needed quiet time to process the emotional demands of teaching adolescents who carried complex burdens of family stress, social pressure, and economic uncertainty that affected their ability to focus on academic material or engage constructively with their peers. Her martial arts training had taught her the importance of maintaining mental and emotional equilibrium, particularly in environments where conflict was common and stress levels remained consistently elevated. The few minutes of solitude that room 118 provided allowed her to center herself and prepare for afternoon classes that would require her to be fully present and responsive to students' educational and emotional needs. Professor Miguel Santos had emphasized throughout Sarah's training that the most dangerous moments in any confrontation were those that preceded actual physical contact. When intentions were forming but actions had not yet been committed, creating opportunities for skilled practitioners to redirect energy and change outcomes through awareness, positioning, and strategic communication. These teachings had shaped Sarah's approach to classroom management and her interactions with difficult students, helping her recognize when tensions were building and providing her with tools for de-escalation that went far beyond the conflict resolution techniques she had learned during her teacher preparation program. The heightened awareness that accompanied her martial arts practice had become an integral part of her professional identity, informing her ability to read classroom dynamics and respond appropriately to students' unstated needs and concerns. The economic disparities that shaped social relationships at Riverside High School reflected broader patterns of inequality that characterized Clearwater as a community where old money, new money, and working-class families competed for resources and status in ways that created lasting divisions between children who had done nothing to earn their positions in the hierarchy. Jake Williams's family wealth provided him with advantages that extended far beyond material possessions, encompassing access to legal representation, political influence, and social connections that insulated him from consequences that might otherwise have modified his behavior patterns. This protection had allowed him to develop increasingly sophisticated strategies for exploiting others without facing meaningful accountability, creating a feedback loop where success in manipulation reinforced his belief that such tactics were not only acceptable but actually demonstrated superior intelligence and strength. The peer dynamics that surrounded Jake Williams's core group involved complex negotiations of loyalty, protection, and mutual benefit that resembled the structure of organized crime families more than typical adolescent friendships, with clear hierarchies of power and carefully defined roles that maximized each member's contribution to the group's objectives while minimizing their individual exposure to consequences. Ryan Chen's technical expertise provided strategic advantages that Jake could not achieve through intimidation alone, while Mason Thompson's physical presence served as both deterrent and enforcement mechanism that gave weight to threats that might otherwise be dismissed as empty posturing. The peripheral members who orbited around this core group served important functions as witnesses, messengers, and sources of information that expanded the group's influence throughout the broader student population. The cafeteria environment itself had been shaped by decades of administrative decisions that prioritized efficiency and cost savings over student safety and social development, resulting in a space that amplified rather than contained the natural tensions that arose when large numbers of adolescents were compressed together during unstructured time. The acoustic properties of the room meant that conversations had to be conducted at volume levels that made privacy impossible, forcing students to perform their social identities rather than simply exist comfortably with friends. The furniture arrangement created bottlenecks and blind spots that facilitated the kind of ambush tactics that bullies preferred, while the limited adult supervision ensured that most incidents would be witnessed only by other students who had learned through experience. That intervention carried significant personal risks. The cultural norms that governed student behavior at Riverside High School had evolved through years of informal negotiation and occasional dramatic confrontations that established precedents about what types of actions would be tolerated, what consequences might follow various forms of transgression, and which individuals possessed sufficient power to operate outside the usual constraints that applied to the majority of the student population. Jake Williams had earned his position within this system through a combination of inherited advantages, strategic thinking, and willingness to escalate conflicts beyond the comfort level of potential opponents who preferred to avoid confrontation rather than risk injury or humiliation. This reputation had become a self-perpetuating asset that allowed him to achieve desired outcomes through reputation alone, reducing the need for actual violence, while maintaining the credible threat that such violence remained an option if his authority were seriously challenged. The timing of Sarah's appearance in the cafeteria coincided with a period when Jake Williams had been feeling pressure to reassert his dominance after several weeks, during which his group's activities had been relatively subdued due to increased administrative attention, following a previous incident that had generated parent complaints and negative publicity for the school. His followers had begun to exhibit signs of restlessness that suggested their loyalty might waver if he failed to provide the kind of excitement and validation that had originally attracted them to his orbit, creating internal pressure for some form of dramatic action that would re-establish his leadership credentials, while demonstrating to potential rivals that his power remained undiminished by temporary setbacks. The psychological profile that Ryan Chen had developed through his surveillance of Sarah Martinez suggested that she possessed the kind of emotional investment in her teaching mission that could be exploited to create maximum psychological impact from whatever humiliation they chose to inflict, ensuring that their actions would resonate far beyond the immediate moment of confrontation. Her obvious dedication to helping struggling students and her apparent belief that education could transform lives made her particularly vulnerable to attacks on her professional competence or personal character, while her distance from family support systems meant that she would have limited resources for emotional recovery if their campaign against her proved successful. Mason Thompson had been observing the movement patterns and body language of potential targets throughout the cafeteria, his predatory instincts activated by the opportunity to demonstrate his value to the group through strategic application of intimidation tactics that would reinforce their collective power while maintaining plausible deniability about their true intentions. His role in previous incidents had established him as the member most willing to cross lines that others might hesitate to approach, earning him a reputation for unpredictability that made his mere presence sufficient to discourage resistance from victims who understood that escalation would likely favor the aggressors rather than those attempting to defend themselves. The convergence of these various factors had created what systems theorists might recognize as a critical juncture, a moment when small actions could trigger consequences far out of proportion to their apparent significance, reshaping relationships and power dynamics in ways that none of the participants could fully anticipate or control. Sarah Martinez's simple decision to retrieve her lunch during peak cafeteria hours had placed her in an environment where she was maximally vulnerable to the kind of coordinated attack that Jake Williams specialized in orchestrating, while the absence of meaningful adult supervision and the presence of an audience that could validate or reject their performance added additional pressure to a situation that was already unstable and potentially explosive. The moment of decision crystallized in Jake Williams's mind with the clarity that often accompanies actions that feel inevitable, even as they represent conscious choices to cross lines that cannot be uncrossed. Sarah Martinez's presence in the cafeteria during peak hours had created an opportunity that aligned perfectly with his need to reassert dominance after weeks of relative inactivity that had begun to generate subtle but noticeable questions about whether his influence remained as absolute as it had appeared during the previous semester. The homemade lunch container she carried represented more than simple sustenance in Jake's strategic calculation, embodying the kind of personal vulnerability that could be exploited to maximum effect while maintaining the appearance of harmless mischief that would protect his group from serious administrative consequences. The psychological mechanics of crowd psychology that Jake had learned to manipulate required careful attention to timing, audience awareness, and the delicate balance between entertainment value and plausible deniability that allowed him to operate within the gray areas of school policy where intentions mattered more than actions, but proving intentions remained nearly impossible for adult authority figures who had not witnessed the full context of any given interaction. His reputation had been built through hundreds of these carefully calibrated incidents where the cumulative effect of seemingly minor transgressions created an atmosphere of intimidation that extended far beyond what any individual action might justify, establishing patterns of fear and submission that persisted long after specific incidents had been forgotten or dismissed by administrators who preferred to avoid confronting problems that required sustained attention and political courage to address effectively. Ryan Chen's technical expertise had provided the group with detailed intelligence about Sarah Martinez's daily routines, dietary preferences, and personal habits that could be weaponized to create maximum psychological impact from whatever form of harassment they chose to deploy, ensuring that their actions would resonate with symbolic meaning that extended far beyond the immediate physical consequences of theft or property damage. His research had revealed that Sarah prepared her own meals as both an economic necessity and a cultural connection to her family background, making her lunch container a particularly valuable target because its loss would represent not merely inconvenience, but an attack on her personal identity and financial stability that could generate the kind of emotional distress that Jake found most satisfying to observe and exploit for the entertainment of his followers. Mason Thompson had been conducting surveillance of Sarah's movement patterns throughout the cafeteria, noting the routes she typically followed, the timing of her appearances, and the defensive positioning she instinctively adopted when navigating crowded spaces that suggested either previous experience with harassment or training that had taught her to remain aware of potential threats while maintaining the appearance of casual normalcy. His military-style reconnaissance had identified the optimal interception points where they could approach her with maximum surprise while maintaining multiple escape routes that would allow them to disperse quickly if adult intervention appeared imminent. Though his confidence in their ability to avoid meaningful consequences had grown through months of successful operations that had never resulted in serious disciplinary action, despite generating numerous complaints from victims and witnesses. The peripheral members of Jake's social circle had begun to exhibit the restless energy that typically preceded group actions, their conversations becoming more animated and their laughter more frequent, as they unconsciously prepared themselves for the adrenaline rush that accompanied coordinated acts of aggression against vulnerable targets. These supporting players understood their roles intuitively, having participated in similar incidents throughout the semester, though their enthusiasm for the planned harassment stemmed more from desire to maintain their own protected status within the group than from any genuine malice towards Sarah Martinez specifically. Their presence served multiple strategic functions, creating the appearance of broader support for Jake's leadership, while providing witnesses who could corroborate whatever version of events the core group chose to present if questioned by authorities later. The environmental factors that would influence the success or failure of their planned operation included the positioning of faculty members throughout the cafeteria, the density of student traffic in various sections of the room, and the fetus aojaka acoustic properties that would determine whether their actions could be conducted quietly or would inevitably attract attention from adults who might feel obligated to intervene despite their general reluctance to become involved in student conflicts that carried potential for escalation beyond their comfort zones. Jake had learned through experience that timing was crucial in these situations, with windows of opportunity opening and closing based on factors that required constant monitoring and rapid decision-making about when to commit to action and when to abort missions that had become too risky to pursue without unacceptable probability of negative consequences. Coach Davis had begun moving through the cafeteria with increased frequency and purpose, his military-trained instincts responding to subtle changes in the social atmosphere that suggested brewing conflict, even though he had not yet identified the specific source of his concern or determined what form of intervention might be appropriate given the complex dynamics that governed student relationships at Riverside High School. His presence represented the most significant obstacle to Jake's planned operation, though previous experience had taught the group that even Coach Davis could be neutralized through careful timing and misdirection that exploited his inability to monitor all areas of the cafeteria simultaneously while maintaining his other responsibilities as both educator and authority figure. Dr. Patricia Hayes had noticed unusual patterns in the social media activity of several students associated with Jake Williams' group, with increased private messaging and cryptic references that suggested coordination of some form of group activity, though the deliberately ambiguous nature of their communications made it impossible for her to determine whether they were planning something relatively harmless like a surprise party or something more problematic that might require preemptive intervention. Her attempts to decode their intentions were complicated by the sophisticated techniques they employed to avoid detection, including the use of private platforms and coded language that reflected Ryan Chen's influence in teaching them operational security measures that would have impressed professional intelligence operatives. The broader student population had begun to sense the shift in energy that typically preceded major incidents involving Jake Williams' group, with conversations becoming more subdued and movement patterns subtly altered as individuals instinctively sought to avoid being present when whatever was brewing finally erupted into action. This collective awareness represented one of the most troubling aspects of the culture that had developed at Riverside High School, where students had learned to recognize the signs of impending violence or harassment with the precision of meteorologists tracking approaching storms, adjusting their behavior to minimize their own risk while remaining powerless to protect potential victims or prevent incidents from occurring. Sarah Martinez had become aware of the increased attention she was receiving from multiple directions, her martial arts training having sensitized her to the subtle changes in energy and positioning that indicated when individuals were transitioning from casual observation to active targeting, though she had not yet identified the specific nature of the threat or determined what response might be most appropriate given her dual role as both potential victim and authority figure responsible for maintaining order and protecting students under her supervision. Her body had begun responding automatically to these signals by entering a state of controlled readiness that allowed her to continue moving naturally while preparing for the possibility that she might need to defend herself or others without advance warning about the form that aggression might take. The institutional failures that had created conditions where systematic harassment could flourish with minimal consequences reflected decades of administrative decisions that prioritized public relations and legal liability over student safety and educational mission, resulting in a culture where teachers and students alike understood that help would arrive only after damage had already been done, and that victims who complained too loudly or persistently risked being labeled as troublemakers who were disrupting the carefully maintained fiction that serious problems did not exist at Riverside High School. This environment had taught students like Jake Williams that they could operate with impunity as long as they avoided actions that generated media attention or political pressure that might force administrators to acknowledge patterns of abuse that they preferred to treat as isolated incidents requiring individual rather than systemic responses. The psychological profile that guided Jake's approach to target selection emphasized victims who possessed characteristics that made them simultaneously vulnerable to attack and unlikely to generate effective resistance or meaningful support from authority figures or peer groups, with new teachers representing particularly attractive targets because their professional insecurity and desire to be accepted by students created opportunities for manipulation that more experienced educators had learned to recognize and deflect. Sarah Martinez's obvious dedication to her teaching mission and her apparent belief that she could establish meaningful relationships with even difficult students made her especially susceptible to attacks that combined personal humiliation with professional undermining, ensuring that any successful harassment would resonate across multiple dimensions of her identity and potentially drive her from the profession entirely. The timing of the planned operation had been carefully calculated to maximize impact while minimizing risk, with Jake Williams waiting for the moment when Sarah would be most isolated and vulnerable, while adult supervision remained at its daily minimum and the student audience reached optimal size to ensure that their demonstration of power would be witnessed by sufficient numbers to generate the reputation benefits that represented the primary motivation for their behavior. The lunch period represented the perfect intersection of these factors, providing 30 minutes during which normal classroom structure was suspended and social hierarchies could be reinforced through spectacular displays of dominance that would be remembered and discussed long after the immediate incident had been resolved or forgotten by adult authority figures. Ryan Chen had positioned his laptop to provide real-time surveillance of administrative offices and faculty movement throughout the building, using his access to the school's wireless network and security systems to monitor for any signs that their planned operation had attracted unwanted attention from authority figures who might arrive unexpectedly to disrupt their activities. His technical capabilities had evolved far beyond what his computer science teacher imagined possible, encompassing sophisticated encryption techniques, social engineering strategies, and electronic warfare tactics that would have impressed military intelligence specialists, though he used these skills exclusively for causing emotional pain and social disruption, rather than contributing anything constructive to his community or educational environment. Mason Thompson had begun the process of psychological preparation that preceded his most effective performances, entering a mental state that combined predatory focus with emotional detachment in ways that allowed him to inflict psychological trauma without experiencing empathy or remorse that might interfere with his effectiveness as an intimidation specialist. His ability to project menace through posture, facial expression, and proximity had been refined through months of practice and observation, incorporating elements of criminal psychology and psychological warfare that exceeded the sophistication of most professional law enforcement training programs, though he applied these techniques exclusively to terrorizing classmates who had done nothing to deserve such treatment. The cafeteria environment had reached the optimal conditions for Jake's planned operation, with noise levels sufficient to mask conversations and movement, while visibility remained clear enough to ensure that their actions would be observed by the maximum number of witnesses who could later spread word of their demonstration throughout the broader school community. The positioning of faculty members had created a temporary blind spot in the area where Sarah Martinez would be most vulnerable, while the density of student traffic provided both cover for their approach and sufficient audience to validate their performance as a display of power worth remembering and discussing in contexts that would reinforce their reputation for unpredictability and willingness to target even adult authority figures. The moment had arrived when continued planning would become counterproductive and action was required to maintain momentum and group cohesion, with Jake Williams feeling the familiar surge of adrenaline that accompanied transitions from strategic thinking to tactical execution in situations where success depended on speed, coordination, and the ability to exploit brief windows of opportunity before circumstances changed in ways that might favor their target rather than themselves. His decision to proceed represented the culmination of weeks of preparation and months of reputation building that had led inevitably to this moment when all factors aligned to create conditions where their planned harassment could unfold with maximum impact and minimal risk of meaningful consequences. Sarah Martinez had reached the point in her journey across the cafeteria where retreat would require her to abandon her lunch and return to her classroom hungry, while continuation forward would bring her directly into the zone where Jake Williams's group had positioned themselves for optimal interception, creating a tactical situation where her options had been reduced to confrontation or surrender without her conscious awareness that she was walking into a carefully prepared trap. Her martial arts training had taught her to recognize such moments of commitment, when movement in any direction carried consequences that could not be avoided through wishful thinking or diplomatic maneuvering, though she had not yet identified the specific nature of the threat or prepared appropriate responses for the particular form of aggression that was about to unfold. The convergence of all these carefully orchestrated elements had created what chaos theorists might recognize as a critical threshold, a moment when small actions could trigger consequences far out of proportion to their apparent significance, reshaping power dynamics and personal relationships in ways that none of the participants could fully anticipate or control. The stage had been set, the actors had taken their positions, and the audience was in place for a performance that would test everything Sarah Martinez had learned about strength, wisdom, and the delicate art of responding to aggression with controlled power that served justice rather than ego. The point of no return had been reached, and the next few minutes would determine whether Jake Williams' reputation for invincibility would be enhanced or shattered by his encounter with a quiet teacher who carried secrets that none of them could imagine. The strike came without warning as Jake Williams moved with the fluid confidence of someone who had never encountered meaningful resistance to his will, his hand shooting out to snatch Sarah Martinez's lunch container from her grasp, with the practiced efficiency of a predator who had perfected the art of taking what he wanted from those he perceived as powerless to stop him. The familiar weight of the homemade enchiladas disappeared from Sarah's hands so quickly that for a split second, her mind struggled to process what had occurred, the sudden absence of something she had been holding, creating a moment of cognitive dissonance that Jake had learned to exploit, as his victims struggled to comprehend that someone had actually dared to steal from them in broad daylight, surrounded by dozens of witnesses. Ryan Shen and Mason Thompson had positioned themselves with military precision to block potential escape routes while creating the appearance of casual conversation, their movements coordinated through months of practice in similar operations that had never resulted in meaningful resistance from victims, who understood intuitively that fighting back would only escalate the situation beyond their ability to control or predict. The psychological impact of their coordinated presence was designed to overwhelm targets with the realization that they were outnumbered and outmatched, creating conditions where submission seemed like the only rational response to aggression that could escalate unpredictably if challenged by someone foolish enough to believe that principles mattered more than practical safety. Jake held Sarah's lunch container above his head like a trophy, his voice carrying across the cafeteria with the theatrical projection of someone who understood that public humiliation required an audience to achieve maximum effect on both the immediate victim and the broader community of potential future targets who needed to understand that challenging his authority carried consequences that extended far beyond whatever immediate satisfaction resistance might provide. His words dripped with the casual cruelty that he had refined through years of practice, designed to strip away dignity while maintaining the pretense that his actions represented nothing more than harmless fun that only oversensitive victims would interpret as genuine aggression worthy of adult intervention. The cafeteria had fallen into the kind of unnatural silence that accompanies moments when everyone present recognizes that they are witnessing something significant, though most students remained frozen by the combination of shock and self-preservation instinct that had been conditioned through months of observing what happened to those who attempted to intervene in Jake Williams's demonstrations of power. The acoustics of the room amplified every word and every sound, creating an amphitheater effect that transformed the incident into a performance with clearly defined roles for aggressor, victim, and audience members, whose participation was limited to witnessing and remembering whatever lesson Jake intended to teach through his latest display of dominance. Sarah Martinez felt the familiar sensation of time slowing that she had experienced countless times during sparring sessions, when opponents committed to attacks that created opportunities for skilled practitioners to demonstrate the difference between aggression and controlled application of technique. Her 8 years of Brazilian Jiu Jitsu training had taught her to recognize the precise moment when someone's confidence became their greatest vulnerability, when their belief in their own invincibility created openings that could be exploited by those who understood leverage, timing, and the psychological dynamics that governed all forms of physical confrontation. Jake Williams had just made the tactical error that Professor Miguel Santos had warned her about, allowing his need for public validation to override the caution that might have protected him from consequences he had never been forced to consider. The response that emerged from Sarah's muscle memory had been programmed through thousands of hours of practice, her body moving with the fluid precision of someone who had learned to read intention through posture and positioning long before conscious thought could interfere with optimal reaction time. Her left hand moved in a seemingly casual gesture to stabilize Jake's extended arm while her right foot stepped slightly forward to improve her base, creating the foundation for a technique that would demonstrate the difference between theatrical aggression and practical application of force, designed to control rather than destroy. The movement appeared so natural and unforced that most observers would later struggle to explain exactly what had happened, though the results would be unmistakable and impossible to deny. Professor Santos had drilled into Sarah the fundamental principle that Brazilian Jiu Jitsu was chess played with the human body, where positioning and leverage could overcome size and strength through scientific application of mechanical advantage and psychological pressure. The wrist control technique she applied was a modified standing manipulation that incorporated elements of joint locks and pressure point activation, designed to create immediate compliance without causing permanent damage or leaving visible evidence that might complicate administrative review of whatever incident reports would eventually be filed. Her grip appeared gentle and conversational to casual observers, though Jake Williams immediately understood that he had encountered something far beyond his experience or ability to counter. Jake found himself suddenly and inexplicably unable to lower his arm or release the lunch container, his wrist locked in a position that created increasing discomfort as he attempted to struggle against what felt like an invisible force that had somehow gained control of his body without him understanding how or when the transition had occurred. Sarah's fingers were positioned with surgical precision on nerve clusters that Professor Santos had taught her to locate through anatomical study and repetitive drilling, creating pressure that increased exponentially with any attempt at resistance while maintaining the appearance of casual physical contact that could be dismissed as accidental by anyone who had not witnessed the full sequence of events. The technique Sarah employed required minimal effort to maintain while creating maximum psychological impact on someone who had never experienced physical helplessness in the presence of his peer group, a perfect example of the leverage-based principles that made Brazilian Jiu Jitsu effective regardless of size or strength differentials between opponents. Her voice remained calm and conversational as she explained to Jake that he would be returning her lunch and apologizing for his behavior, though the words carried undertones of absolute certainty that suggested she possessed resources for enforcement that extended far beyond what any previous victim had been able to threaten or demonstrate under similar circumstances. Ryan Chen and Mason Thompson had begun to move forward with the intention of supporting their leader, but Sarah's peripheral vision had cataloged their positions and intentions with the precision of someone trained to handle multiple opponents simultaneously, her free hand shifting into a position that would allow her to defend against additional attackers while maintaining control of her primary target. The subtle adjustment in her stance communicated to anyone with experience in physical confrontation that she was prepared for escalation and confident in her ability to handle whatever additional challenges they might choose to present, though her preference clearly remained focused on resolving the situation through the minimum force necessary to achieve her objectives. The psychological warfare that Professor Santos had taught as an integral component of effective martial arts practice was evident in every aspect of Sarah's demeanor, from her relaxed breathing that demonstrated complete emotional control to her steady eye contact that communicated both respect for Jake as a human being and absolute refusal to be intimidated by his reputation or the presence of his supporters. Her training had emphasized that the most effective techniques were those that convinced opponents to defeat themselves through their own resistance, creating situations where aggression was transformed into cooperation through mechanical advantage rather than brute force, or dramatic displays of athletic ability that might escalate conflicts beyond what educational environments could safely contain. Mason Thompson had frozen in a position that revealed his complete inexperience with situations where intended victims possessed superior skills and confidence. His usual tactics of intimidation and physical presence rendered useless by someone who clearly understood how to handle multiple opponents while maintaining control of the primary threat. The realization that they were facing someone with professional-level training in physical confrontation created a psychological shift from predatory excitement to genuine concern about consequences they had never been forced to consider during previous operations against helpless targets who lacked the knowledge or ability to resist their coordinated attacks effectively. The transformation in cafeteria dynamics was immediate and unmistakable as students throughout the room began to understand that they were witnessing something unprecedented in the social history of Riverside High School, where Jake Williams had operated with apparent impunity for years without encountering anyone capable of neutralizing his aggression through superior technique and unshakable composure. Conversations had resumed at whispered levels that suggested everyone present was processing what they had witnessed, while trying to understand what it meant for the social order they had accepted as permanent and unchangeable, their fundamental assumptions about power dynamics and hierarchy cracking under the pressure of evidence that contradicted everything they thought they understood about strength and vulnerability. Coach Davis had begun moving toward the confrontation with increasing urgency, as his experienced eye recognized the signs of a physical altercation in progress, though his military training also allowed him to appreciate the remarkable skill and restraint that Sarah was demonstrating in controlling the situation without causing injury or creating the kind of spectacle that would inevitably draw administrative attention and formal disciplinary procedures. His approach was cautious and measured, designed to provide support if needed while avoiding interference with what appeared to be a masterful example of conflict resolution through controlled application of superior technique and psychological pressure that addressed the immediate problem without escalating it beyond manageable parameters. Jake Williams had never experienced physical helplessness in the presence of his peer group, and the combination of pain, embarrassment, and genuine fear created a psychological cocktail that stripped away the layers of confidence and bravado that had defined his identity throughout his high school career. His attempts to maintain verbal aggression while trapped in Sarah's hold only emphasized his powerlessness, creating a feedback loop where each word revealed more clearly how completely the situation had shifted beyond his ability to control or predict. The lunch container remained suspended above his head like evidence of his own foolishness, a symbol of his overconfidence transformed into a monument to his miscalculation and the hubris that had led him to target someone whose capabilities extended far beyond what his previous experience had prepared him to handle. The nerve pressure that Sarah was applying through her wrist control created a sensation that Jake would later describe as feeling like electricity running through his arm, though the technique was designed to create discomfort rather than damage, allowing her to maintain control while demonstrating the futility of resistance without crossing the line into genuine assault that might trigger criminal charges or civil liability. Professor Santos had emphasized throughout her training that the goal of martial arts in civilian contexts was to create compliance and ensure safety rather than to punish or inflict suffering, though he had also taught her that mercy should never be confused with weakness, and that some situations required decisive action to prevent greater harm to innocent people. Sarah's voice carried the kind of quiet authority that comes from genuine confidence rather than desperate bluffing, her words designed to provide Jake with a path toward resolution that would allow him to preserve some dignity while acknowledging the reality of his situation and the consequences of his choices. She explained that Brazilian Jiu Jitsu had taught her that real strength meant protecting others and solving problems without causing unnecessary harm, though she made clear that her preference for peaceful resolution should not be mistaken for inability to escalate her response if he chose to continue testing the boundaries of her patience and restraint. The educational tone of her explanation served multiple purposes, providing Jake with face-saving context for his compliance while demonstrating to the assembled students that effective self-defense was based on principle and training rather than anger or desire for revenge. Ryan Chen had pulled out his phone with the intention of recording the incident for later analysis and potential use in social media campaigns designed to humiliate Sarah, but his hands were shaking too badly to operate the device effectively as he began to understand that his technical expertise and electronic warfare capabilities were useless in situations where physical presence and real-world skills determined outcomes. His carefully constructed identity as the intellectual mastermind behind their group's operations was crumbling under the realization that all his surveillance and planning had failed to identify Sarah's true capabilities, leaving him feeling exposed and vulnerable in ways that his previous experience had never forced him to confront or address. The apology that eventually emerged from Jake Williams carried the kind of genuine remorse that comes from suddenly understanding the difference between theatrical power and actual capability. his words stripped of the casual arrogance that had characterized his interactions with classmates for years. The transformation in his voice was so complete that students who had known him since elementary school struggled to reconcile this subdued and respectful tone with the aggressive persona he had cultivated through months of systematic intimidation and cruelty. Sarah accepted his contrition with the grace of someone who understood that humiliation was a tool to be used sparingly and only when necessary to prevent greater harm, releasing her hold gradually to allow him to lower the lunch container and step back while maintaining enough distance to respond appropriately if he chose to interpret her mercy as weakness rather than strength. The lunch container was returned to Sarah's hands with a care that bordered on reverence, Jake's movements deliberate and respectful as he seemed to finally understand that what he had stolen represented far more than simple food, but embodied connections to family, culture, and personal identity that his privileged background had never taught him to value or protect. The symbolic weight of the moment was not lost on the assembled students, who recognized that they had witnessed not just a physical demonstration but a lesson in the kind of strength that came from discipline, preparation, and moral clarity, rather than inherited advantages or willingness to inflict suffering on those less fortunate or powerful. Dr. Patricia Hayes had arrived at the cafeteria entrance just in time to witness the resolution of the conflict, her trained eye recognizing immediately that she was observing the aftermath of an incident that had fundamentally altered the power dynamics within the student body in ways that would require careful monitoring and strategic intervention to ensure that positive changes were reinforced while potential negative consequences were identified and addressed before they could destabilize the broader school environment. Her relief at seeing the situation resolved without violence or injury was tempered by awareness that Jake Williams's public defeat would create vacuum in the social hierarchy that might be filled by students whose leadership would prove even more problematic if not guided carefully. Principal Johnson had been summoned by multiple text messages from concerned faculty members, though by the time he arrived at the cafeteria the immediate crisis had passed, and students were beginning to disperse with the kind of excited energy that followed witnessing historic events whose significance they understood intuitively, even if they lacked the vocabulary to articulate what they had seen. His administrative instincts told him that whatever had occurred would require careful documentation and strategic communication to prevent the incident from being misrepresented by parents or community members who might view any physical confrontation as evidence of inadequate supervision or failed institutional policies. Sarah Martinez returned to her classroom with her lunch intact and her dignity enhanced, though she understood that the demonstration of her capabilities had created new responsibilities and expectations that would influence every aspect of her teaching career at Riverside High School. The quiet confidence she had always possessed had been revealed publicly for the first time, establishing her as someone who could be trusted to protect herself and others when circumstances required decisive action backed by superior skill and unwavering moral clarity. Her students would look at her differently from this day forward, recognizing that beneath her gentle demeanor lay resources that extended far beyond what they had imagined possible in someone whose primary mission was education rather than enforcement. The ripple effects of the incident would continue to spread through the school community for weeks and months to come, as students who had witnessed Jake Williams's defeat began to understand that resistance to bullying was possible and that apparent victims might possess hidden strengths that could neutralize even the most feared aggressors. The culture of fear that had dominated social interactions at Riverside High School for years would never fully recover from the demonstration that power based on intimidation could be overcome by skill, preparation, and the courage to act when action was required to protect fundamental principles of human dignity and respect. Jake Williams would spend the remainder of his high school career learning to rebuild his identity around positive rather than negative leadership, his encounter with Sarah Martinez having provided him with the kind of powerful lesson that no amount of counseling or disciplinary action could have achieved. The humility forced upon him by his complete defeat would eventually become the foundation for genuine growth and development, though the process would require him to confront years of entrenched patterns and learned behaviors that had served his ego while damaging his character and relationships with others. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.